Well, hello, good morning, and welcome to this Insights Live from Space Store, live streaming from Clerkenwell. Of course, in case anyone didn't know, this is Clerkenwell Design Week, so we're here in person in the Space Store Design Centre and are joined by our panellists we're going to introduce shortly. So I'm just going to give it a minute or two just while everyone gets logged in, whether you're joining on Zoom, whether you're on the live stream on LinkedIn, or whether you're in person in our studio. So we'll just give it a couple of minutes. Good. Well, hello and welcome, and thanks for joining us. So we are live streaming from Space Store's London Design Centre today in Clerkenwell during Clerkenwell Design Week, and excited to be chairing this or co-chairing this discussion around sustainability and longevity in design, and very excited to be joined by our panelists. We'll be introducing the panelists individually, and they'll be able to share some of their background and experience, and then we can dive into the conversation. So as we go through today's discussion, we'd love to invite your questions, whether you're joining from Zoom or LinkedIn Live, or whether you're in person in our studio. Feel free to either use the Q&A or the chat, or if you're in person, tag one of the Space Store team and we can make sure that we're bringing the questions into our conversation. Discussion today is around sustainability and longevity, and we're joined by three great panelists. So I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves. Steve, maybe do you want to kick off?
Sure, yes, I'm Steve Collins. I'm an architect, designer and writer. I've been doing workplace design for 25 years for several major firms, mostly financial, legal and media sector clients. I love workplace design because I'm very interested in how physical environments express and shape organisational structures.
Good, thanks, Steve. Good to have you with us. Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Chris Crawford. I'm a designer by background, but I'm the studio director in one of our workplace interiors studios in our Ghent, London office. I'm particularly passionate about experiential design and making sure that we're always putting the human and their experience at the center of all the decisions we make in the design process.
Good, thanks, Chris, and good to have you with us. Looking forward to hearing your perspectives. Deepak.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Deepak Palmer. I'm a design director at MCM. I'm also our B Corp lead as well. So I'm very passionate about not just our impact through our design projects, but also how we as a business can have a much larger impact than the sum of our parts, I suppose.
Very interesting. Good. Thanks, Deepak. Shane, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Shane Barry and workspace concept advisor at Space Store. So my main role is working in the London area with the architects, so like to our panelists we have here, helping them with their client journeys and how our products can help define the space they're creating for their workspace clients.
Good. And finally, I'm Alex Harvey. I'm also with the Space Store team, focused on working with some of our global clients. Again, similar to Shane, working with our clients to understand their workplace needs and challenges, and sometimes the opportunities and maybe the stretch goals that they're trying to achieve, and then how we can support with customized workplace furniture and modular pieces that support their workplace objectives. And I guess that kind of leads us into the topic, which is very, very much around, I think, the two sides, longevity and sustainability. And I think they're two sides of the same coin in many ways. But would love to just kind of kick open the conversation, maybe to get each of you to share some thoughts around the kind of core principles that you see when we're thinking about longevity and sustainability. What are the kind of the foundations when you're working on a new client or a new project? You know, where do you start? Do you want to kick off, Deepak? Give us some thoughts.
Sure, yeah, I think you're right. I think, you know, you can't really have sustainability without longevity built in. And I think one of the big things that probably means to me is something that people value. I think actually when you value something, you're more likely to want to retain it and keep using it. I mean, in our office, a lot of furniture is vintage furniture. It's had a previous life. And actually, everyone that comes in really appreciates that. And yeah, you can see that they really actually like it rather than it just being a new piece of furniture that no one has a relationship to. Actually, I think there's something about that kind of previous history and the previous story behind a piece which people really like.
Good. Go on, Steve. Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, sustainability really means being able to do something indefinitely without making things worse. So it's the opposite of the extractive mindset. So I think that has two aspects actually. One is with the new stuff that we have to make. You know, it's about circularity, locality, if that's a word, and quality, longevity, as we say. But then the other issue that we have to face is all the existing stuff in the world. How do we retain it, upgrade it? What do we do with it when we have to get rid of it or change it?
Good. Thanks, Dave. Yes, interesting. Chris, and any thoughts around longevity, sustainability there?
Yeah, I think one of the important things to consider is actually the purpose behind what you're doing. I think to understand that as well, not just through the lens of like the immediate requirements, but thinking about the life cycle that product will have, or that space will have, and all of its component parts, whether that's even within the use of one specific client, and thinking about how there can be adaptability, flexibility, and kind of this idea of purpose built for change built into the design process. But then also thinking about, well, maybe it's okay that there is a very specific and finite need for that product or that space for that client, but thinking about what that legacy is and where it can be, kind of moved on and reused or repurposed in another form or capacity.
It's interesting. You've kind of all three touched on that kind of idea of reusing, Deepak, about vintage furniture and reusing, repurposing. I'm curious to know, like, is that happening in reality? Do we see, when a client is looking at a new space or a change to an existing space, how much does that form a part of the conversation, and does that actually translate? Does that actually appear on the final project that gets delivered?
Yeah, I mean, from our experience, I think the vintage market in commercial interiors is still very immature, and I think that puts a lot of people off. But in terms of reuse from their existing spaces, absolutely. I mean, we've seen a huge increase in that. I think clients are becoming far more conscious about their waste. I think waste is probably a bigger issue for the fit out world than emissions are. So actually, I think people are becoming far more conscious about that. But again, what we're seeing is that the pieces that they want to reuse are pieces that they perceive as being valuable. So you'll get the design classics that they'll really want to reuse because they've kind of stood the test of time. They're durable or they're adaptable in some way. So I think those are the pieces that they particularly are keen to reuse.
I think there's something interesting about the familiarity that, with more design classics or more vintage furniture, there's something that I guess you see those in people's homes. There's a degree of comfort associated with that, maybe even in hospitality spaces. So there's a connotation associated with environments and experiences that people want to have.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we struggle with is there's a lot of corporate office furniture that looks like it belongs exclusively and only in an office from 2010.
Absolutely.
And then in that instance, those are the things that are really difficult to think about how you repurpose them, or if you were to take them and relocate, what is the impact that will have on the overall experience and look and feel of the space that you're designing. So I think like one of the challenges is to make sure that when we're designing new products or we're specifying new products, we really think about like, what is its relation to trends? How does it relate to a specific point in time, and how robust and the actual aesthetic, let alone the function, what is the longevity associated with that?
Yeah,
Interesting.
I agree with all of that, actually. I mean, certain things like task chairs, I can't remember the last time I did a project where we actually bought all new task chairs. That was like the first thing to be kept and upgraded, and there's been a long market for that. And then it moved on to desks. But then there's the problem, as you say, of the corporate stuff that was very much desired 15 or 20 years ago. is now getting in the way quite badly of the social changes of the workplace, not the technological really. And it is a big challenge, I think, on all of our projects. I found it so, as to how we deal with that without just chucking it all out. And I think to perhaps take a longer term view, we've actually we've been through a technological revolution over the last 20, 30 years, which has had a massive impact on things like furniture, design, because if you go back 50 years, the stuff didn't have to deal with technology. It didn't have to line up with floorbox grids or lighting grids and things like that. So the things were actually much simpler. And ironically, therefore, they had longevity if they were built to that quality. And I've come across things from the 70s on other projects where I've thought, this is a tank, it'll last 50 or more years. We don't need to do anything with it if people can be persuaded to keep it. But I think we're dealing now with a lot of high quality stuff from earlier in the curve of the technological revolution that we don't quite know what to do with now because things have moved on.
Is that a trend generally though? I think, with stuff that has got inbuilt longevity, it is just simpler, right? If you look at classic Braun products, there's one dial and that's it. So they're probably easier to fix, and just by design, they're a much simpler piece. And I think actually they're the ones that people still want and, really kind of look after. So I think there's an over complexity, as you said, of modern day design.
There has been. I mean, I'm thinking of go back 20 years, think of all the systems furniture that everybody was buying into that were very complex, sophisticated systems designed to handle the monitors and the cabling and all the needs and things, and buy our system and you'll be future-proof forevermore. Actually, what it didn't count on was the fact that the technology itself might change radically or even vanish from the desk. And then what do you do with the desk? And I think our challenge in reuse at the moment, or what I feel is a challenge, is how do we reuse this stuff from the early 2000s? There's actually really good quality because people really invested, and now we look at it and it's too cold, it's too corporate, it gets in the way.
The other thing we've seen, and this is kind of veering into the whole hybrid workplace topic, which isn't really the subject for today, but I think the way people use their workplace and the types of work settings that people now want can be very different, or a part of it can be very different. So we talked about desks and task seating. There's always going to be an element of that, but there's other new types of work points that clients are now saying, to make our workplace effective, efficient and frictionless, very important from an employee experience point of view, we need something different other than desks. And some of those, I guess, just don't exist previously or didn't exist previously.
I've been saying for years, actually, that we should flip the workplace design around. The desk is the last resort. The desk only belongs to the specialists that need the desk. It shouldn't be the default, whereas it's always been used as the default marker. The client says, well, if I give everybody a desk, at least I know they can come in and do some work.
Yeah.
And I've always wanted just to flip that around and say, no, just give them the space and say, what do you need in it? But then what do we do with all the desks that we've already got?
I think that's because people's definition of work is flawed, right? People think work is when you're sat in front of the screen or sending emails. Talking to people is still work. Building relationships in the office is still classed as work. So it's just more of a mindset shift that I think has to happen.
Yeah, and I think also some of the spaces that we're looking at a much varied sense of typology in the workplace of different settings. There's a lot more recognition now, because we were just talking about it earlier on neurodiversity and the fact that one space that might be perfectly adequate for somebody to work at or ideally suited for them to be their most productive is not going to be the same for someone else. So providing that variety and choice, I think, is really important. I think people feel a lot less inspired by just homogenous and endless sea of workstations, right? So I think people are becoming more attuned to that.
And I guess as designers, you have to almost be a futurist. You have to start thinking about what the people want next year, not what are they asking for now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is fundamentally one of the ideas of, I think, furniture specification is, whatever you specify has to, at the very least, be able to be adaptable over the course of a client's lease, right? 10 to 15 years. I mean, if it can't do that, then it's failed at the first hurdle. I mean, ideally, you then actually think about is life after those 10 to 15 years. But I think there's too much furniture where you specify it, and you're probably thinking that's only going to, they'll change that in 5 years' time. And it's massively flawed. It creates so much waste.
But I think, if, again, there's models that we've spoken about of like leasing furniture and other things. So I think when you have this idea of ownership, it's very much like, I buy this, it sits in place, and then if we don't want it, we get rid of it.
Yeah.
But I think if you see yourself as part of like a broader network of, people and users, use it for the time that's appropriate. And then when you don't need it, I think getting rid of that association of it then having to be thrown away, actually someone else can use it and it will provide value for them in a different setting. And I think if you go back a few years ago, I think even the idea of leasing, but even thinking about ethically clearing a space after you've used it, at the end of your lease, there's so many companies now that are set up specifically to consider how you ethically clear a space, how you responsibly clear a space, how you can divert a lot of the furniture pieces, finishes to other organizations that can use them. Previously, I don't think there was as much of a robust network to allow that to happen in a successful way. It became quite cumbersome and quite difficult to do. But now I think there are companies specifically set up to do that, so that I guess the stress is taken off organizations to figure out what they're going to do with every single piece. So I think seeing yourself as part of something wider than just your individual company is a good mindset as well.
Really interesting. And just kind of shifting gears slightly, would love to hear about, we've talked about the human experience and I think touched on some of the stories behind, and I guess when we're thinking sustainability, this is more than furniture, right? This is the entire workspace and the building and the impacts. But I think here's some of the narratives that get employees excited, the people who use the space excited, and bringing those or making those narratives visible. Love to hear any kind of stories, anecdotes, clients, projects you've worked with that you can share where that's been brought to life and you can actually get the people, because we were hearing from one of our global clients recently. They were saying about sustainability is a big part of employee attraction now. Your story as an organization and your ESG and is a big part of talent attraction. So yeah, I'd love to hear any kind of stories that you can share around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of narratives is incredibly powerful because if you get the narrative right, it will change habits, which will change actions. So actually, I like to think that actually, if you've got a really ethical employer, then that will also then impact the way that you live in your personal life as well. I think it can also be slightly dangerous though. I mean, I was at a panel recently where there was a fairly high emitting company who had a very sustainable office space. And I kind of walked away thinking, this is kind of a way of greenwashing your employees because your real estate only makes up 2% of your emissions. And you haven't really spoken about the other 98%. You've just focused on the 2. So I think it can be dangerous as well as providing opportunity. But you've got to, I think you've got to be able to see through it and do it in an authentic way if you're going to do it. It can't just be stories to try and make people feel good.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned as a B Corp, I guess you've had to kind of, or you've also moved workspace recently, right? So you've probably had to think about how you present that to your staff internally and to the outside world as well.
Yeah, and look, when we started designing our studio, we had a very clear vision. We wanted to kind of create a very holistic way of looking at things. So our entire supply chain were pretty much, we didn't use anyone that we normally use. We worked really hard to kind of find what's called the smaller scale suppliers, much more local suppliers. Many of them were B Corps themselves. And actually, we've told the stories for those organizations since. So, for example, the guys that do our planting, for example, are a company called The Glass House. They've just won a gold medal at Chelsea, actually. And they create a training program for female inmates. And they train them in horticulture so that when they leave prison, they've got a job to go to. Now, I speak to one of their employees who had been given a 10-year sentence. And she said, out of her group of 30 female inmates, not a single one of them reoffended. And so, this idea of much longer lasting kind of social impact as well, I think comes into this idea of like, how do you supply, how do you specify in the right way? And how do you think about much longer term impacts over just the project itself?
Yeah, I think when you can tell stories that talk about it's more responsible design, which has like sustainability, it has diversity, equity, and inclusion. It has socio or social stories to tell. I think all of those contribute to create essentially a sense of pride, right? And what we quite often do is when we're working on a project, we will tell these sustainable stories, and it will sit sometimes with just the real estate team who are effectively our client. It's like, how do you make sure that those stories go beyond? And I think it's the power through storytelling that actually means that end users and the colleagues and people that are occupying the space actually get to hear those, kind of live them, and then also retell them to visitors coming through.
Yes.
And I think there are lots of mechanisms that you can do that. And like, for instance, we were working on a project with a really large atrium space, and the base of the atrium was all old marble flooring, but there was no power or data in that base of the atrium. And the whole point was to try and make that activated and make it a place where people can come and work, rather than assuming you just work at your desk.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to do that, we had to surgically remove some of that marble to get access and provide power, under the floor. But what we did is took the marble that was then taken out, actually crushed that and turned it into an aggregate for the terrazzo top of the bar that was in that area, so that it could then, it's still in the same space. It was actually repurposed by a company in the UK. And then making sure that even that story, because even though it's evident, you can see that the flex and the aggregate within that terrazzo matches the floor outside, people still might not necessarily connect. So it's like, how do you even have QR codes and other things that people can kind of scan and then understand, like, a lot of the thought and consideration that's gone into some of the aspects of the space that they're using?
I mean, it feels like we have to, I mean, as you know, we're at the front end, we do the design. Most of the sustainability journey for anything we do is going to lie with the client. They're the ones who are going to look after it, repurpose it, find things to do with it, and tell the stories to each other. So it almost feels as though we have to, with the client, develop a playbook almost, or a handbook or a storybook that has to be handed over. And then it's their responsibility, and it has to be embedded in their culture. I mean, I've done a lot of stuff with clients who are really keen on sustainability, but it's actually all the province of a particular technically minded subset of people. And they have a sustainability committee, and you sit through these enormously long meetings doing checklists and things. And you think, how does this impact the actual employees? How can we make anybody care about this? There is a whole job to be done in terms of corporate storytelling, internal storytelling. And equally, often it's an initiative that comes from certain people, and then they move on. And then the thread gets dropped.
I think we've worked in some instances to talk to, say, even the HR teams, so that you say in terms of recruitment, trying to tell those stories to attract talent, but it's also making sure that sometimes at day one, the existing staff will come in and they'll hear some of these stories as well, or just understand like what's going on. But if you can actually integrate it into the onboarding process,
yes,
and if you have like a user guide, or you have like the opportunities or the mechanisms to convey those stories, I think then anybody that joins the company after that point will actually still get that same experience and access to that knowledge.
And that is almost becomes like a tribal storytelling. Then, like, I was talking to a client recently, and they were commenting that they now see their people telling the stories of some of these sustainable products to visitors, to other employees. And I can remember, like, there was one particular product, I think it's called Solid Wool, which is made from the fleeces of 2 sheep. It's a chair product. That resonated with me, and I now think about, like, I remember that I've never even seen the product in real life, right? But there's the stories that you remember and you pass on.
I think it makes it tangible, right? I think as sustainability experts, we can get very bogged down in the data and the actual emissions, and for most people that means nothing, right? So actually making it tangible, making it something they can actually grasp and understand, I think is far more powerful. And like you say, it becomes part of company culture after a while. Everyone understands why you've made those decisions, and becomes part of the business of the purpose of the business. So yeah, hugely powerful.
Just got a question here, and this is probably a predictable one perhaps, but the kind of budget versus longevity. So if you've got a client who's maybe stretched against budget, how, like, ways to embed both sustainability and longevity. And I guess it's a perception that sustainable products cost more. Not always the case, but I'd be interested and love to hear your experiences. Steve, anything you can share on that?
Well, I'm thinking that this is where reusing what you've got actually kicks in. And I mean, so far, or in a lot of the jobs I've been on, that reuse has actually been driven by budget. It's like, we don't spend the money, but there's actually a better story to be told about that, and there's a more creative story to be told there. So I think a bit of imagination as to what have you already got, and how do we reuse as much of that as possible, which is inherently sustainable, to give us a new future, to tell a story, you know.
Yeah, and I think I was having this conversation with a client just yesterday, and you know, when you do the cost kind of value, the cost benefit exercise, like many people just do it for a moment in time. You've got to think about it over the course of your lease, and
whole life,
you know, actually, when you put it out over 15 years, you're like, oh, if we use that and we know we're going to get use out of it, then actually you're going to get huge benefit out of it. So actually, I think, you know, being able to buy good quality stuff first and foremost, that you know is going to last, that is going to be adaptable for your future needs, or will go on to have another life. I think being able to lay out the kind of longer term impact, I think, is what really sells it to clients for me.
Yeah, and I think there is a cost associated with certain certifications on a project, and therefore even the products that you specify in order for those products to have an EPD, there's a cost associated with that, and you know, it kind of all gets built in. There are some incredibly sustainable and locally sourced products from smaller scale manufacturers or artisans that are inherently sustainable, but they might not have all of the certifications to demonstrate, you know, that they are. And so sometimes you need to kind of question, like, what is your main motive? Is it to be able to demonstrate it, or is it to also be able to do the right thing? But I think when it comes to budget as well, some of the interesting conversations that we've been having with our clients is traditionally what you have is a CapEx budget, so your expenditure for the project and the fit out, and then you have an OpEx budget for the maintenance and the running of your of the space. And we've been having the conversation, is there some of that CapEx that can actually be shifted into your OpEx costs, so that when you do the fit out, you're thinking about how can you create a sense of simplicity in the design? How do you create something that is still like beautiful, still well designed, but it's functional? And it's almost like, what is that minimum viable product that you can have at day one, knowing that your needs are going to evolve over time, and knowing that no matter how much engagement you have, no matter how much work you go in and how much acumen you put into the design, there's always going to be 10% or 20% of the project that doesn't quite get used the way you anticipate it, and human behavior, yeah, like culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So you can have all these ideas, but it depends how it gets used. But knowing that you've got some of that budget that's been shifted into your OpEx means that you can actually evolve and tweak those things over time, so that those spaces no longer become obsolete or the kind of white elephant that you've got. They're able to change and bring out the best, you know, working people.
I guess that's where leasing comes in, right? Because it's like product as a service then. So actually you shift it exactly as you said, you shift out your CapEx, put it in your OpEx. You've got it over much longer term. I mean, all of our functional furniture in the office is from a company called Nornorm, and it's all leased. So all of our desks, all of our task chairs, even our meeting room tables. And actually, you know, we know it gave us inbuilt flexibility. It meant we didn't have an upfront CapEx cost. So actually we could start to really think about how we might flex a space over the course of our lease.
And it's interesting at your point around EPDs, because I think I was on a webinar recently where they were talking about repurposed and, you know, vintage pieces, maybe repurposed floorboards, that kind of thing, that you physically can't get an EPD on that. So like common sense says that this is like inherently sustainable, but you can't get the checkbox.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think it's, like you said, common sense approach, right? Realizing like what is your true objective, and do you necessarily need the certification to prove that?
And just got a question here with kind of changing tack slightly, but social sustainability and then companies supporting and promoting their local community. And I know I can think of a few examples that, Chris, I know that project we did with you many years ago for the Stephen Lawrence Association was an interesting one. But if you can share some stories around that.
Yeah, definitely. So the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust, they were set up. Stephen Lawrence was a young man. He was at the age of 18, was unfortunately and tragically murdered in a racially motivated attack. But he was studying to be an architect. or had the ambitions to study to become an architect. So the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust was set up to bring individuals from ethnic minority, underrepresented backgrounds into the field of architecture through mentorship, through bursary funding, and other means. But they had the Stephen Lawrence Centre. They came to us and asked us if we could create a small co-working space for some of their alumni that are freelancing architectural assistants to be able to use at a more subsidized cost as opposed to other co-working spaces. And when we went on the tour of the building, we sort of said, I think you need to do almost the entire building. It's an ecosystem here. And I think for it to be more compelling than a series of desks in a room with maybe a kettle, we can actually create something that's, much more interesting. So we went through the process of designing the space, presented it to the board, to Stephen's mother. And it was a really emotional presentation. I think it moved us all in terms of like what they were trying to achieve. But at that point, Baroness Lawrence stood up and said, like, this is amazing, but we can't afford this. Like, how are we going to do it? So we then spoke about the fact that we're part of an industry. We have lots of connections. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to provide all of this, but we're going to reach out, see. We got a contractor on board, and we reached out to all of our network for suppliers, manufacturers, and Space Door was one of them. And everyone was just really eager to get on board to contribute to, bring this to fruition. And I think it was an example of how everybody in the industry gave something, a small kind of part of something bigger that all came together, to be something far greater than the sum of its parts. And I think we always take the opportunity as we're working through to find these clients and these partners to do some kind of community impact or offer our design services to create something.
It's a great story. Thanks for sharing. Really interesting.
I think it's got much easier as well to find the right suppliers who are having quite a positive social impact. I mean, from where you buy your coffee beans to like your cleaning companies, all of there. If you search hard enough, there's always one that is kind of going above and beyond. And so actually, I think it's become much easier.
Yeah.
And I guess with all of these things, it's then resharing the stories, because usually what differentiates, as you say, whether it's coffee beans or whatever it is, there's a story behind the product or the sourcing or the production, or there's a story behind it, right? And then resharing that to the users of the space or the visitors to the space.
Well, people share them because it says something about you, right? It says like, I care about this, or like, this is a priority to me. So I think it's just always making sure you're tapping into the sense of pride around the things that you're doing, really understanding the business's values and how the choices you make exemplify that.
Interesting. And then thinking about kind of the future and looking forward, anything you can share around kind of social, either changes in practice or maybe things that you think need to change in practice, in terms of, looking at the next 5, 10, 15 years, maybe people who are tuning into this webinar who aspire to be an architect one day or an interior designer, what are the things you would share that you think might make an impact?
Huge one, actually. So I was reading a report last week, which is created by a consortium of Danish architects and construction professionals. And they basically broken down what their industry would have to do to reach Denmark's net zero goals. And in the next 5 years, they basically need to reduce their emissions by 96%, which is a mammoth task. But actually, they come together, they recognize that it's a mammoth task, and they're basically now writing policy for the government to say, this is how we need you to regulate us. And so I think and some of that will come through sustainable design, some of it will come through retrofit, but fundamentally, quite a large part of that will just come through building less. And actually, I think the big trend for younger designers is, how do you almost become like a degrowth designer when you've got so many constraints? How do you use kind of your innovation and creativity to be able to design within those constraints in an industry where we'll probably be forced to make less stuff? And I think that's something that a lot of designers should be thinking about now.
Yeah, agreed.
One of the things which is perhaps even like more future looking, I guess, is to no longer think of ourselves as like architects and designers, and I guess the teams that we have when we're looking at a given project are comprised of architects, designers, maybe even we have some behavioral psychologists and other things. But I think looking at even ecologists, looking at biologists and people that have an understanding of the impact of what we do as it integrates into wider systems. And I think understanding much better that network of living systems that we're a part of, I think will help us understand and reach the point where we're no longer trying to keep our impact at net zero, but we're actually creating interventions in the world that actually improve it. So it's kind of a much wider aspiration, but I think it's something really interesting to start to consider.
Interesting. And Steve, anything to share around that, around the kind of future practices? I know you shared some of the things that you saw coming 20 years ago. It'd be interesting to hear what's the next 20 years going to look like.
Yeah, it's difficult, as you say, because yes, you're right. We actually have to build less, or possibly do less, or make less, and that's very tough because we're inherently geared up to do more, or to make more, or to make the new. It's it's what we're almost what we're for as designers, as opposed to heritage consultants. So that's a huge cultural turnaround, I think. And it's particularly challenging in somewhere like the City of London, where they're talking, you see the plans for how many more new towers they're building. It's like, how does that culture get critiqued and pulled back on? I think that's very difficult for us because in the end, somebody is buying our services and wants us to do things. So it's difficult from a professional point of view, whatever our own thoughts and principles.
Well, I think there's like also globalization around design, right? So like all of the buildings that we occupy now, if they're corporate office space, there's an expectation that it's kind of steel, glass, there's HVAC and other modern conveniences that we have. And it's like, if you go back 200 years, 300 years, actually architecture was so vernacular, it was so varied, and it was responsive to the land, it was passive, using local materials. So I think one of the interesting things is how we can start to fight back against more of this sort of globalized homogenization and think, how can you be much more localized? How can you change what people perceive as beautiful? How can you change what people perceive as or looking at responsible design and realizing that that's the thing that we need to aspire to, rather than something that looks the most aesthetically pleasing in comparison to the latest project in a magazine or like online.
One of the big challenges is just there's so much financially driven, which is why we're seeing 40-story residential towers in the suburbs of London. It's because the land is worth that much. And the buildings are assets that sit on the land, and they do whatever they need to do to make the finances work for the asset, which is again something that didn't much exist 300 years ago. It did exist to a degree, but not so much. So I think that's often our biggest challenge, is that driver is actually a financial one, whatever we say, because everybody knows that culturally we shouldn't be doing it, or in terms of sustainability, we shouldn't be doing it. Somebody wants to make money somewhere. Somebody who lives somewhere else, usually. I'm very cynical about this, actually.
Sorry, Deepak, you're going to say something.
I can't remember what I was going to say now. No, go on.
And maybe again, shifting tack slightly. So thinking about kind of tools or initiatives, things that either you use or you see being used to kind of promote longevity, sustainability, the kind of core topic we're talking about today. Anything you could share? Again, the audience are always interested to hear real life examples, maybe things that individuals could use or businesses could use and kind of promote within their own organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was thinking about this morning. I was thinking, what makes a design classic? Is it the piece itself, or is it the way it's marketed at the time? Like, what are the parameters of getting something that will be continued to have a value in 50 years time, in 100 years time? And I don't know, I'm not sure it's such a clear-cut answer.
There's an X factor there.
Yeah,
as well, right?
exactly, there is. And maybe they were just marketed in the right way, and suddenly they became really popular, and like you said, people have them in their houses. Maybe that's all you've got to do, is create pieces that have got multifunction or could be housed in different scenarios, right? Maybe that is the kind of X factor that you're looking for to create the kind of value.
It's difficult because it's basically like saying what makes a hit record.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's almost that.
We need a Simon Cowell of the design.
You said X Factor.
But yeah, I think there's some interesting ways of kind of pushing it. So the company that we bought a lot of our vintage furniture from is a company called Rehouse, and they basically guarantee that when you come to want to sell your pieces, they'll buy it off you. Like they're guaranteed to buy it back off you because they know it's inherently got value. And so I think, just being able to kind of give that message to a client, say, look, don't worry, like, you'll get your money back on this piece at some point in the near future when you've come to stop using it. I think, again, just kind of clever marketing, I suppose, clever messaging like that works.
You're just looking after it for a period of time until the next.
Exactly. You're a steward of the piece, right? Yeah, and you'll look after it and then it'll go to the next person.
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting one about longevity of classics. You know, I mean, I've got certain bits of furniture at home that will outlive me.
Yeah.
So I have to put them in my will to say who gets them. Because look, and actually good furniture, I mean, almost any good furniture has a century's life in 2 centuries. A lot of it's indefinite, timber or metal or glass or whatever, or natural materials. You maybe have to reupholster something once every 30 years or something, say 3 times a century or 2 times a century even. And that's an interesting way of looking at it. There's all this stuff that I think we've lost sight of that a lot of the time, certainly in the furniture industry, the way it's gone. Because as you say, we've got the design classics, and a lot of the design classics that we think about they're now old enough to be fallen out of the trap of fashion. Most of them have been through that period of being in fashion and then actually being thrown out. Sometimes you look back at things and you think, oh, I remember that. Where did they all go?
Yeah.
And you think, oh shit, they actually got thrown out.
Yeah.
All that stuff that was really good, all those things from, say, the 70s or something like that, I saw them, where have they all gone? They've been destroyed, which is tragic, But then things fall out of fashion and we just see them for what they are. But I think the really long-term ones there's a consideration has gone into the design, perhaps, that makes them a classic, that they've been worked through properly at some point by the designers. Not with an intention to make a classic, but just because the designers were actually doing something for the first time or doing it early enough to have to work through from fundamentals. I know, of course, then the market now is filled up with Me Too things, to hit price points primarily. It's like, you get a side chair, and perhaps the first one was designed by the Eameses, and that's the classic. And then actually there's lots of very similar ones made in cheaper materials because people want the look, but they can't afford the classic up front. But of course, the one that's just the Me Too one will break sooner or whatever.
I think the whole thing reminds me of there's a great advert for Patek Philippe watches, and I remember the tagline used to be, "You never own a Patek Philippe watch, you just look after it for the next generation." And I was like, this is such a good piece of marketing. Like, it's got an emotional connection. It's a good message. Like, you're just a steward of a piece, and then you pass it on to the next generation.
I guess the challenge though is about longevity versus cost in a lot of what we're doing, because as we've said, the things that are classics, the Patek Philippe watch, bloody expensive. But that's where the longevity comes from. So that's the challenge, I think. We'd all love to give our clients design classics.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the conversation we're having is around like furniture pieces, right, and the design classics. But I think in the built environment, there's so many aspects of even material choices that aren't the final finish that you see, but they're kind of hidden behind walls, within walls, under the floors, and other things like that. So one of the processes that we're going through at the moment is our Genza sustainability or product sustainability standards, and that's identifying the 10 material choices within any given project that have the most carbon impact, and then identifying very specific criteria that the manufacturers need to meet. And if they do not meet that criteria, we will not specify them. And then we're starting off with the 10 kind of highest impact. And then over the course of each year, introduce more materials
10 and
into
then the
that.
next
Yeah,
10, yeah.
exactly. Because at Gensler, we cover 1.25 billion square foot of projects every year. And I think if organizations that have that kind of, I guess, impact or scale, if we're not making the decision to draw the line somewhere, we'll just keep kicking the can further and further down the road. So I think there's that initiative that we're using that I think is really helpful to people to also draw their attention to what other things that may seem like that greenwashing piece that maybe aren't as impactful to like some of the things that you don't necessarily see that have a huge impact. So I think that helps. Also doing the life cycle carbon analysis on a project really helps to identify certain things that you can just change the backing of a carpet tile, or you can change the aluminium framing in acoustic panels, and suddenly you've like reduced the carbon impact of your project, like, you know, dramatically. So I think there's that. And we're also going through the process now with our materials library of digitizing every single sample that we have in the library now has been vetted for its sustainability criteria. There's a QR code on the back. You scan that and it has 12 different criteria that it's kind of rated against, whether that's its toxicity, whether that's its embodied carbon, how far away it is from the site. So against all those 12 criteria, you can see on a scale of like 1 to 10 where it sits. And if you have specific KPIs, whether that's tracking carbon, you know, you're going to choose the 3 materials samples you're looking at. You can choose the one that has the lowest carbon impact. But then if there are other key KPIs like locally sourced materials, you can then isolate that. But if you don't, and you just want to know overall what is the most sustainable option, it sort of aggregates all of those scores and gives you a number. And I think that really helps us in our process when you don't have the time to essentially do a research piece on, you know, everything that you're specifying. It cuts out a lot of that kind of workload to make sure that there is at the very least a baseline of sustainability standards that we introduce to our projects, whether or not the client wants it.
Interesting. How do you do it? I mean, having been involved in similar exercises, one of the biggest challenges has actually been getting the basic information in a consistent and understandable form for that kind of exercise.
So we actually have a team that is based and focused on doing just that on all the materials. So it's like by condensing it down to very specific few team members, that's all they're focusing on. It means that you don't get then the inefficiencies of every other team member potentially even duplicating all that work and those tasks. But I think a lot of the information, people are trying to be a lot more transparent. There's certain information that is available and isn't available, and that's also made clear, you know, in that process. And the ones that we don't have enough information on, they don't feature in our library.
I'm hoping that it's something that's moved rather quickly. I mean, I am an architect. When I first got involved in workplace, almost my first questions was how do we do recycling? How do we recycle materials? And at that point, this is going back like 25 years or so. They said, well, we can't. We just throw it out, you know. And I was horrified. You know, and it's felt like a very slow process to actually get to the point where all this stuff is coming up to consistent standards. We're having to drive a lot of it actually by refusing to specify, driving the market.
Yeah, definitely.
You know,
Interesting what you're saying, Chris. So, you know, Gensler is an organisation that has an element of scale. You know, how could you translate that? Is that something you're offering to other design practices to kind of feed off the benefits of the system you're creating, or how do you see that translating into the wider interiors market?
So I have to be candid. I'm not sure actually what the aspiration or ambition is to share that like freely, that information. But at the same time, I think understanding the pressure that puts on other manufacturers to make sure that they are then doing the right thing, because there is a commercial impact to them, not the amount of work that they will miss out on from being specified. So we see that as the mechanism to start to shift and change the industry, is by using our scale to nudge and push the actual manufacturers and suppliers.
We were trying to do that at TP Bennett as well, and very sort of similar processes. I mean, what I'd hope is that this pushing ought to cause manufacturers and suppliers to start producing more consistent data up front.
Mm.
You know, if we're saying to, we as the specifiers are saying to them, we won't want to specify you because you're not actually giving us consistent and understandable data.
Mm.
That should be a challenge to them, even if they're actually doing something sustainable and doing the right thing. They have to prove it in ways that we can understand and use and feedback to clients.
I mean, that's the issue with the EPDs, right? Just because there is transparency doesn't mean that the designers have the time to read through all of that and understand what the implications are, compare it against others. So I think, yeah, just because it has an EPD, sometimes there's an assumption that therefore it's sustainable, and that's far from the truth.
Absolutely.
So it's like how companies can invest in the time to actually process what that information is telling them and how it impacts the project.
I think going back to your earlier question, I do think there's far more collaboration within the industry at the moment. I mean, I'm part of a lot of advocacy groups across industry, and actually people are way more open about, look, here's what's working for us. Yeah, they might not be sharing actual systems, but they're very much saying, look, this is what we're doing, this is what's working, this is what's not working. So I do think that will increase as well over time. I mean, I think it has to. You know, we've got to obviously keep an element of our competitive edge, but also, you know, if we're going to truly shift the industry, we're going to have to collaborate far more than we do at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of those, I was interested the kind of the idea of a team focusing on it, but then that becomes like a force multiplier, so that all of the design teams or architecture teams that they're supporting can make informed choices, or it can steer them towards choices that make a big difference in the overall.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing a shift in some of our clients now as well, that we're talking about money and just the idea of how much something costs, and if it's sustainable, it costs more. Therefore, people will make choices based on that. But I think there is a lot more pressure on people, on companies, to understand value beyond monetary costs. And even having the conversations, like, it's no longer about just identifying what the monetary budget is, but what is the carbon budget of the project, and kind of looking at ways that you can push and pull between those two.
I mean, this ought to be valuable, shouldn't it? Because it's a story that a business or a client can tell the world about itself. So it ought to be a good story to pick up. I think that so far there's perhaps been the reluctance to pick it up, or there's been things to hide. I think that's one of the biggest challenges from business point side of things, is that people have a lot of skeletons in the cupboard from the past, and there's great reluctance to actually expose that.
I think this will become much more commonplace. I mean, we back the Better Business Act, which is all about basically forcing companies to do annual reporting, right? And actually, I think you'll have to get to a point. I mean, if the government's truly going to meet their own net zero goals, they'll put that pressure directly down onto industry. And so at some point, industry will have to annually report on all of their emissions. So I think it'll just become much more commonplace. It's moving far too slow at the moment, I agree, but I think it will increase over time as we get closer to kind of 2030, 2050. It's going to have to.
I think all of these companies have the goals, and they've got, you know, they've published what their aspirations are. And I think sometimes it's our responsibility as designers to help them navigate through that, or understand, like, if you make this choice, you're fundamentally going against what you've said here, or you're going to set yourself back. And sometimes they're not aware of that, you know, in the decision. It just seems like, oh, well, you know, they're being spoken to by perhaps the QS, no offense to QSs, but you know, the lens could be purely from, like, how do we save money? How do we go through value engineering? But it's like how you constantly go back to some of the fundamental principles, either on their website or that you've agreed from the outset of your project, you know, that they've bought into. So I think constantly going back to that as your sort of compass in the project is important.
I think there's nothing more powerful than putting a mirror up in front of clients. I mean, it's
Look
really
at yourself.
Exactly. It is really surprising though how many of them haven't made the link between their own net zero commitments and their real estate. And you're like, how have you not connected the two? It's going to play a massive part in your overall emissions. So you have to think about it if you're ever going to hit your goals. So yeah, I think the whole mirror, look, you've said this, are you actually going to do anything about it? It's really powerful. Holds them to account.
Yeah, and the communication channels that allow that to happen, you know, from our position as a manufacturer, to be able to communicate that this product or this material, because we're all specialists or experts in a particular aspect of a project, and the client's not going to know all of that information. So it's actually our responsibility to be able to know and to share and say, well, this doesn't meet the goals that we're trying to achieve, or this is going to mean that whatever impact it's going to have.
For sure.
And kind of takes us back to where we started around the narratives and the stories behind the space. So yeah, just conscious of time, I think we're coming to our last few minutes. So be glad of any kind of final thoughts, any takeaways you think that we could share with the audience, maybe anything new that you've picked up and learned from our discussion today.
I think my main takeaway would be, you have to be bold. Like, if in an industry where our actual job is making stuff, like, how do we inspire people to use less? Like, that's a real dilemma that I think the design industry now faces. And I think actually you've got to be bold and you've got to be brave to take that stand and to have that kind of mindset.
Yeah, and kind of tagging on to that, I can't take credit for this, but our sort of head of sustainability in our region is Juliet Morgan, and she told a story the other day. So the power of storytelling is making its way through. But she talks about the fact that we have human nature, and what she means by that is that in nature, no one has specifically told the birds how to fly in unison. No one has told the fish like how they swim. But in terms of like when you see birds flying in formation like that, all it takes is for one bird to spread from their wingtips and touch two other birds to then actually make the movement and how it spreads across in the aggregate. So I think if you think about what are your values and what are your principles around sustainability, you live that. And if you can influence just two other people and they can influence just two other people, we'll actually start to see how that ripples through society and affects change. So I think don't get overwhelmed or feel so kind of insignificant or futile in the efforts that you make, because there's definitely opportunity to shift the dial.
Good. Any final thoughts, Steve? Yeah, I think it almost comes back to the full circle to where we started. Actually, give people stuff that they will love, because if they love it and it's robust, they'll keep it, they'll repair it, they'll want to look after it for a long time. So the love part will actually help massively with the sustainability goals, I think, in the long term. And even in defiance almost of corporate culture, perhaps. People will still want that stuff. So I think that's a big thing. But I think that there's another aspect of that, which is about fashion, in that people are very much hostage to fashion, I think, as a culture. Because
why are you looking at me?
Because it drives consumption, and we've been encouraged to go down that because we've got to, as a culture, we've got to push back on that. We've got to stop seeing something as out of date. Just because it bears the marks of being made 10 years ago doesn't mean it's worthless and out of date. Fashion drives social value, and that's got to be resisted if we're to have longevity.
Brilliant. Yeah, really appreciate it. And I guess from my point of view, I guess just kind of piecing together some of the things we talked about, the impact of a whole ecosystem, because we're all part of a whole ecosystem, but the impact that an individual or a business or a design practice that everyone needs to make a difference, and that's what's going to shift the needle for the whole ecosystem. Yeah. Sorry, Shane, I haven't really brought you in. Give us some thoughts.
I'm learning. Probably similar to Steve in terms, I guess, from work I've done. How do we help people have that experience where they love what space they're in and how they can tell that sustainability story, like you're saying, ongoing, and share it with others. How we help them create that space. So.
Good. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks very much to our audience for joining. Had some questions, I think, from the audience in the room and also online. So really appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.